Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's program at Inforum at the Commonwealth Club. I'm Julie Hanna, Executive Chairwoman of Kiva and advisor to X, where technologies like the driverless car are invented. And tonight we have with us Airbnb Strategic Advisor of Hospitality, Chip Conley, and Airbnb's founder and CEO, Brian Chesky. Many of us have associated Airbnb with millennial travel, especially in the early days. At the age of 52, Chip, who had founded Joie de Vivre Hospitality, joined the company. And in the years since, Chip and Brian have given the world a new way to think about hospitality, and as they say, the rest is history. Tonight we're going to talk about their relationship, their journey at Airbnb, and how it inspired Chip's book, Wisdom at Work, The Making of a Modern Elder. Please join me in welcoming Chip and Brian. Chip, your book, I found it to be a very thoughtful and inspired manifesto on how companies can harness wisdom across generations and pair it with disruptive thinking. And you also talk about how the modern elder, a term that you coined, can bring great value to entrepreneurial innovators and founders and CEOs like Brian. Well, first of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
What inspired your book and this concept of a modern elder?
First of all, thanks for coming. This is my old habitat, not the Marines Memorial, but literally Sutter Street. Half a block from here was our 567 Sutter offices. We had 4 hotels on this street alone on Sutter. So Union Square was sort of my old hood. And when I joined Brian, when he knocked on my door, so to speak, in early 2013, tech was not my habitat. I didn't know a thing about it. And so what inspired me to write the book ultimately, after almost 4 years of being the head of global hospitality and strategy in the company, was I was seeing a growing number of people in midlife confused and a bit bewildered by the fact that we may all live 10 years longer, but it seems like in a digital society, power is moving 10 years younger. So if you do the math, we have a 20-year irrelevancy gap for people in midlife. And I didn't feel irrelevant. I was lucky. I was gifted by the fact that the founders, the 3 founders, wanted me to join them. But I saw a lot of people who didn't feel that way. And I felt like someone needed to call out the idea that maybe there's a new generational compact that could be created where we can all learn from each other, the different generations. So I was inspired to write it partly because this is my 5th book, and and to be clear to Brian, I never planned to write a book when I joined. I really didn't, because I don't write a book unless there's something I've learned deeply. And this one was, at times in the early days, a bit of a painful lesson. But it was a lesson that I felt like was worthy of getting out there in the world, because more and more people in midlife are trying to figure out how to be relevant.
Brian, I loved your foreword in the book, as opposed to most forewords, which are terribly dry. I thought yours was eloquent and
Luckily, I knew him. So.
Yeah, that's true. That's also rare. You talked about the origin of story of Airbnb and the origin story of your relationship with Chip as well. And one of the more striking things you mentioned is how you and your co-founders, Joe and Nate, really thought of Airbnb as more than just being in the business of home sharing. What did you envision at the time, and where has Airbnb come since?
So when we started Airbnb, it really started one weekend. This international design conference was coming to San Francisco. All the hotels, I was living with my roommate here, we're totally broke. All the hotels in San Francisco were sold out for this design conference. And we had this idea. We said, well, what if we just turned our house into a bed and breakfast for the design conference? Unfortunately, I didn't have any beds. My roommate, Joe, had 3 air beds. We pulled the 3 air beds out of the closet, we inflated them, and we called it airbedandbreakfast.com. So most people don't know why we're called Airbnb. That's why. And back then, I remember saying, one day this will be huge. Thousands of people will use this. And to figure out how many thousands of people will use this, I remember going on the internet and trying to find out the annual airbed sales in America every year. And I honestly thought we were going to get into the airbed business. And I'm like, this is going to be great. And like, I was an industrial designer. The reason I tell you that story is to say this. I didn't know exactly what we were offering when we were starting, what it would become. And what I thought we were offering was a way for people to share what they had in their lives. And we built basically a community that allowed guests and hosts to review each other. And so it was a two-way process. And I thought of the community as like an immune system. But not long after, I was reading, only a few years later, a book. It was, for some reason, I chose to pick up this book, and it was the Cornell University Hospitality Handbook. It was one of their handbooks. And Cornell is considered to have one of the best hospitality programs in the country. Now, to be clear, I was pretty certain we didn't do hospitality. That's what hotels did, and we were not a hospitality company. It was like not something we would do, and we were not hospitality. And I remember reading the book, and something struck me, and it said that hospitality is service with heart. And I thought back to all the hosts I had met, the heart that they'd poured in, the caring, and I started realizing, oh my God, like we have people who know about engineering and design and technology and data science, but like what we do every day is not engineering. That's a means to providing something. And what do we provide? And the big insight was we don't provide space. We provide hospitality. We provide belonging and caring. At that point, I started realizing we need to find somebody who knows about hospitality, but I wanted somebody who also could bridge to the world that I came from. And through a variety of means, I think we invited Chip to come speak, and he gave a talk. He had recently written a book not too long before called Peak, and I actually had read that book, and so I was a big fan of Chip. And he was kind of the original hospitality pioneer. Before Airbnb, there was this movement called the boutique hotel movement. And think of us as like the micro, like more and more boutique. It kind of got moved down to the individual person. So that's really how we connected. And that was at that moment that we realized we're going to get into the business of offering hospitality.
And in fact, if I recall in your forward, you confessed that at Airbnb, hospitality was considered a dirty word.
Yeah, it was one of the words you can't use in the office with the other typical dirty words. We call it the H word. Yeah.
The H word, yes.
So, Chip, how was that for you? Did you feel dirtied by association?
No,
Did you go around and introducing yourself as the hospitality guy?
You know what was interesting is they did invite me to give a talk on the history of innovation in the hospitality business. What was fascinating was at the end of the talk, there was 40 or 50 people in line trying to talk with me. And what I sensed from these engineers and these designers and the variety of people, but there were a lot of engineers and designers, that's for sure, was they really wanted to be in the hospitality business. They were really curious about how do we become a hospitality brand. How do we become a company that's built on hospitality? Now, I had a question in my own mind is like, well, we do a lot of things, we do CX and trust and safety and a few other things that are in-house with our own employees. But the people generally providing the hospitality in the world for Airbnb are these hosts who are not our employees, who are generally doing it part-time, who we can't necessarily train, otherwise they become our employees, so they can opt into education. So it took a lot of psychology to think through what's the process of creating a means for our host community to feel inspired, both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, such that they do a great job of delivering hospitality. And so for me, it was a bit of a puzzle because like, wow, you mean the people providing the hospitality are not our employees? How do you motivate them? But I think we did it in a variety of ways. There was a program called the Superhost program that was already in place, but it only had 200 people. 200 people worldwide, and they hadn't added anybody in a year and a half. And so we just completely remade that program as one thing.
And that's almost 500,000 people today.
Yeah, just in the Superhost.
Almost 500,000, over 400,000 hosts are Superhost, and this is like the kind of quality standard.
Upper echelons. So.
It's actually, I think, a great example of the collision between wisdom and innovation. That you take this idea of hospitality and your accumulated wisdom about that, and marry it with the innovation of hosts that aren't employees.
Algorithm and people wisdom. Those two, high tech and high touch. And I think Airbnb, there's a lot of tech companies that can't say that. I mean, we can, partly because if we don't get the high touch piece right, the high tech doesn't pay off. But, so they work well together.
I think one of the diversity is a huge topic in Silicon Valley. One of the types of diversity that's not often talked about is diversity of age and thought and experience. And it's very typical that a young technology company is a bunch of 20-somethings in an apartment. That was us. And, there's a lot of benefits to being young. One of the benefits to being young is I was so foolish to believe I could actually start a company and it would work. In other words, many people who knew better would never started this. But there were disadvantages. And the disadvantage of being young, one disadvantage is that you have a narrower aperture about life. And that we in Silicon Valley, as we grow, we get a lot of power. And we just have to, power should not be, we have to acknowledge that. You have a platform, millions of people use it, you have a lot of power, and you have to use that power very wisely. And one of the advantages that Chip brought with his experience of 2.5 decades in the hospitality industry is he brought his world of wisdom with him. And so it wasn't that he needed to provide incremental technology expertise. We had that. But we had not a single person who had any experience really in the hospitality or travel industry. And maybe in the very beginning that was freeing, but at some point you have to become expert. And he really widened our aperture about how to think about the world. And I think that was incredibly helpful.
Well, just building on that, I mean, that insight that you had to bring him in actually is unique, even in the way of thinking in tech, because we tend to think, I remember as a young, technology founder myself, you sort of that's industry we're disrupting, they're old school, we're the new guard, and you just sort of charge ahead very naively. But I think there was an insight and wisdom in your perspective about saying, hey, let's go learn this industry. And wisdom is one of those words that's interesting. We banty it about easily, but we have an instinct about what it means, but really the definition of it is not very precise. And you look it up in the dictionary, it says the quality of being wise, which is a very unhelpful definition. But, so what does wisdom mean to you both?
Wow. Let me start, because I have spent a lot of time on this one. I think wisdom is good judgment based upon pattern recognition with a nice alchemy, a perfect alchemy of confidence and doubt. And so let me unpack that for a moment with the confidence and doubt one piece first. Anybody who says that they're the wisest person in the world, and we sometimes hear that from people, isn't very wise. Because a wise person knows what they don't know, and they have a certain amount of doubt about what they are still to learn. The pattern recognition piece is something that I think there's a lot of evidence that when people can actually recognize a pattern, it starts to become intuitive and it starts to become instinctual, and you can actually say, I understand what the right answer is because somehow my past has actually informed me of this. And so pattern recognition, so that's why in some cases you could say wisdom is something you get as you get older, but if you're really, there's no evidence, frankly, I hate to say it to those of us who are older in the crowd, there's actually zero evidence that wisdom and age actually are in tandem. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of studies that show that they're not. Yeah. But if you cultivate wisdom in a way where you actually learn from your mistakes, and that allows you to actually build the pattern recognition, that takes you back to my first part of the definition, which is good judgment. And good judgment has a lot to do with that pattern recognition and the fact that you have the confidence and doubt. So that's a very long-winded way of saying wisdom is something that you probably cultivate over time based upon that collection of ingredients.
Well, that's a good definition. I would say another way of saying it, or something I've learned from Chip, is that wisdom is also understanding the consequences of your decisions. When you're very young, you can be naive. The naivety can be an advantage because the consequences sometimes could edit your thinking. You're like, well, that thing might happen and therefore I won't do it. And being young can be freeing. But not knowing the consequences of your decisions could also create a lot more work on the other side. And when you're starting a company and it's growing really fast, you can't be afforded very much of a learning curve. You think about it like in life, you're afforded all this time to learn things. And then you start a company, and the whole point of a startup is a company designed for scale, and it must grow fast. It's like a rocket getting into orbit. It needs a certain amount of speed to get into the atmosphere. What do you do when you have limited life experience? Even if you have a lot of life experience, if you're entering something new, how do you have a very steep learning curve? And how do you accelerate the learning curve? You have to be incredibly curious, and you have to seek out people that have more wisdom than you. And by the way, many of the most important things in life I found are timeless. They don't actually change. The technology changes, the implementation changes, the details change, but all the regrets you have, all the mistakes I made that I wish I did differently were things that were probably more timeless than like timely. And of course, therefore, I wasn't the first person to learn them. And I like to think that I should encounter and solve for the first time problems that haven't been solved before. But why should I be a guinea pig and solve a problem that has been solved before? And so I learned to go to sources. Instead of reading every book, spend the time finding the definitive source. And that led me to a variety of people, with design. I shamelessly, you have to be shameless, by the way. I shamelessly sought out Jonathan Ive. He is the head of design for Apple. But when it came to hospitality and transformational thinking, here was the person right here.
But
I loved what you said, by the way, about this shameless point. I think you said, why should I learn? Why should I be learning on thousands of people? I think that's a really kind of, it flips that frame of, and it's unique because again, when we're young, we sort of have an omnipotence, and I'm smart and I can figure anything out, and the need to think you can do it all yourself. So. I cut you off.
Well, all I was going to say is whether it's George Tenet, associated with the former head of the CIA, or Stanley McChrystal, or Sheryl Sandberg, the thing that I was intrigued by when I met Brian, and we met the first time, and we were talking, he asked me if I wanted to help him and the founders democratize hospitality. That sounded interesting. So what I was intrigued by was what a curious growth mindset he had. The idea of he was always focusing, he had a voracious appetite for learning. And part of what made me say yes was the fact that I was not the first person who'd come along. I was really the first person. Now, Belinda Johnson had come in a year and a half before me in a senior role with a lot of experience. But in terms of other sort of thought leaders, there are a bunch of thought leaders that Brian was talking to just to sort of understand the playing field. What was different about our relationship was I was going to come in-house and be an in-house person. What was supposed to be 15 hours a week became 15 hours a day.
I knew that.
Almost, yeah, and he knew it.
I knew it.
Explain that. We had a dinner. It was supposed to be 8 hours a week, truly. And we had a dinner at 11 o'clock at night, the night before I was coming in for the first day. And he got me to 15 hours a week. And then...
Yeah, listen, here's what happened. So I was certain that we needed to hire Chip. And I said to Joe and Nate, I'm going to go to his house. I'm going to try to convince him to join. And they said, but I don't think he wants to join. And I said, well... It's kind of like you plant a seed and then let the seed grow, and that seed will be an advisor. And I had this funny reputation of inviting people to speak, ask them to advise. Okay, why don't you work a day a week? It's low commitment. Actually, maybe a day a week, 2 days a week. And as long as you get them over 2.5 days, they're basically working for you without the full benefits, and then it tips over.
True. I said I'll work for free.
You spoil the frog.
I was going to just work for free.
And so at some point I'm like, you're already working for free. Would you like to get paid?
Yes,
a little bit more. So that's a good secret here.
It's a great recruitment strategy.
But I think there's something really important here, which is it's not totally novel for somebody young in Silicon Valley, at least, to have older people that with a lot more wisdom in the periphery. They're also often called venture capitalists. They'll sit on your board. But they often don't bring they often will bring more tech experience, more pattern recognition within a narrow subset, and more importantly, they're not embedded. And so there's a difference between saying, I'm having this issue, and then me telling that person how I think it's going down, and Chip being in the room and saying, Brian, I think you think it's like this, but here's what I'm seeing. In other words, everything when it goes through my filter. And it was really a partnership. It was a mentorship. It was maybe a mutual mentorship, but it was also a partnership. And I think being embedded allows people to offer so much more advice. So I think this model that as people get older, they're mentors, but they're on the periphery, and they're like office hours is one model. But there's no reason why people can't go much deeper. And if you truly want to do something great and change the world, I would encourage people to go much deeper.
Yeah, that idea of embedding, I think, makes a lot of sense. Actually, so in stark contrast with something, I think it was Fast Company quoted you as saying, Chip, that kind of if the fate of Travis Kalanick, the founder and former CEO of Uber, who was ousted by his board for kind of learning curve issues, a series of very naive leadership mistakes, is any lesson. Maybe there's a symbiotic relationship that can exist between digital natives and their elders. So I'd be interested to kind of ask you to speculate. How do you think Travis's journey might have been different if he had had a modern elder embedded at his side through that wild ride?
It's a really hard question to answer because I'm not Travis. So the one thing I'll come back to it in a second. I want to amplify what Brian said because it applies to Travis. It's hard enough to start a company and grow it. And back in my era, when I started Joie de Vivre Hospitality at age 26, it was all bricks and mortar. And we grew really fast, but we grew really fast only in the state of California, mostly in Northern California. We became the largest hotelier in the Bay Area, but the bottom line was it was a pace that has nothing to do with what we're talking about here, especially when it's a disruptive technology that actually is changing the laws. And it's actually, all of a sudden, in our case, in 191 countries. You know, by the time I joined about 4.5, 5 years into the company being alive, and it was a tiny company compared to today, but we were already in 190 countries. And so to actually run, for anybody, including me, to have run that company with that kind of pressure is difficult. So to Travis, difficult. So it starts with a difficult. To his, I don't know enough to be able to say, but what I can say is that it does help having somebody with a different point of view in the room with you. And that, whether the diversity is age or race or gender, it helps a lot. And maybe he didn't have enough of that thought diversity, cognitive diversity on his senior team. It was a lot of people sort of thinking the same way. What I love about Brian is we can intellectually joust. And it's not just us, but there's other people. And I think one of the things I might have helped with Brian on occasion was I was open to, while I tried to intern publicly and mentor privately, that was sort of my thing, I was open in meetings to sort of saying to you, I disagree.
Yeah.
And what that helped was for the other people in the room to say, okay, there's room to actually joust with Brian, because what happens, having been in his role for 24 years as CEO of a company I founded, people often don't want to upset you by saying something in a meeting that you may not agree with. And so a lot of people just end up sort of saying it privately or behind the scenes, when in fact it's going to be a lot more helpful if it happens right there in the room. Does that make sense?
No, totally. I remember asking Sheryl Sandberg, somebody else I sought advice from, and I asked her, this was either 2011, 2012, would have been before Chip Conley got involved in Airbnb, and I asked her, what will be my biggest challenge? And she said, your biggest challenge is that people stop telling you the truth. She said, it will happen, and she thought about it for a minute, she goes, it's probably already happened, you just don't know it yet. And I think that Chip was always willing to tell me the truth. The truth means that you're willing to tell people things regardless of the consequence of how they feel about them, because they care about you. And I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, well, I mean, word has it that you do feed off of each other, and you have that great creative tension, which is so important. And I remember you talking about, for example, that you had decided you weren't going to talk to the hospitality industry, and sort of Chip had kind of different advice for you.
Oh, the traditional hotel industry.
Yeah, the traditional hotel industry. Yeah.
So after hospitality was no longer a dirty word, we start using the word, but what about all the traditional hospitality companies? Not just chain hotels, but what about boutique hotels? What about bed and breakfast? And once again, this was an area that Chip really turned me on to and opened my eyes to, because I started seeing through the lens of what Chip did that many of these hoteliers had the same care and sense of spirit of hospitality, design personality, the same kind of craft, the art of hosting that we were celebrating. And so he completely turned me open to this idea. And I used to say that Chip was one of our secretaries of state in the kind of volatile battles that were with the hotel industry, and he was able to bridge to that industry. Because I mean, one of the biggest benefits was people in the hotel industry were, according to you, I mean, but I heard it. They were very freaked out by us, and I think us being
Well, they were initially, so this Gandhi said back in the
Yeah.
1930s, attributed to Gandhi. Don't know if I wasn't there, but according to Gandhi in the 30s, he supposedly talked about the British and said, first they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they fight you, and then you win. And early on in my time at Airbnb, I actually said that at a company meeting because I said, that's going to be our relationship with hoteliers and landlords and destination marketing organizations and corporate travel managers. There's going to be that arc. And I think partly what helped is that I could be that sort of behind the scenes statesman to talk to them and say, this is okay. And we actually even invited CEO of Hilton, Marriott, and Starwood, and their
he
teams.
hosted the executive team of Marriott in our office. Before Chip joined, that would have been inconceivable.
Yeah, and they came for a day and a half, and we taught them about home sharing and data science and millennial travel habits.
I think one of the things that's interesting is like when you grow up, I think you have this rebel, renegade spirit to you. I certainly did. I think a lot of people do. And because of that, you think, I'm not going to talk to people that are different than me. It's very normal. And that difference could be geography, it could be ideology, it could be industry. For us, it was industry. And Chip really, and Belinda did the same thing. It really reminded me that you should meet with, this sounds completely intuitive, and yet most people don't do it, meet with people that are different from you. And not just like across geographic boundaries, but industries.
Yeah, it's hard to be the villain when you've already been gracious to them and invited them to the headquarters.
I think one of the things you said is hard to hate up close. And just get really close.
And people buy from their teachers.
So I mean,
or they
over
partner
time
with
they
them
did
and-
start to
yeah.
fight us a little bit, but actually generally publicly they have continued to be pretty good. In fact, Arne Sorensen, the CEO and president of Marriott, has a quote on the back of my book, which is shocking, considering Marriott doesn't necessarily align itself with.
But Chip was a really good bridge between the traditional hospitality world and Airbnb. I couldn't have imagined another bridge because it was really hard for me to imagine where they were coming from. It was extremely hard for them to imagine where we were coming from. And I think we often fear what we don't understand. And so we presumably were really scary to them, partially because they didn't understand us. And I think Chip was a really helpful bridge.
But so it doesn't just have to be me. It could be anybody out there. It doesn't have to be a CEO of a boutique hotel company. You could be you could be 50 years old and have 25 or 30 years of experience in the healthcare industry, and you understand it really well. And there's these young disruptors who are actually going to disrupt healthcare using technology. That person, in fact, there's a woman named Bridget Duffy who's here in San Francisco, and that's her role, is to be the sort of the person who understands the industry. She has the know-who and the know-how of her industry. And for those disruptors who are just learning the industry but really know the technology and are big thinkers and great designers, they are a great combination. So this is not just something that has to be a thing for hospitality. It could be in virtually any industry.
Well, what's interesting, as you talk, this back and forth, this collaboration is just so natural. It flows. And yet it stands in such stark contrast with something you and I talked about recently, so how we mythologize this journey of the brilliant hoodie-wearing, tech young founder on a hero's journey, and I think, as you put it, takes us to digital utopia. And so, how would you like to see our views about that lone genius evolve? Because I think in many ways we set them up to fail anyway. It's an impossibly steep learning curve. We create that tension where they have to publicly display, that they know what they're doing, privately not feel like they are. I know I certainly felt that tension. But yet listening to hear, it's like the most natural thing in the world, of course, to have this kind of a collaboration.
Well, so let's start by knowing that it's a relatively recent phenomena that power has escalated and cascaded to young startup founders with companies of this size. It usually took longer in the past. And so I do believe that it's a new phenomena that requires some new structured thinking around it, which is why I think the idea of a digital native and young digital leaders paired with modern elders is is a wise way to go. But I think more than anything, we just have to recognize that these young digital leaders, somehow we expect them to miraculously embody the relationship wisdoms and the leadership thinking that we elders have had decades to learn. So it's really unfair. And yet it's very much what the media does. And it'd be interesting to hear Brian's point of view on it, because there's an element of it that's sort of like exciting and ego-filling, and then there's another part of it that can actually be, you become stereotyped as just the hoodie-wearing CEO, especially here in San Francisco, with the sort of occasional anti-tech perspective that happens in San Francisco. So I don't know. How does that feel?
I don't wear hoodies very much.
Yeah, you don't. You used to wear them more often.
Yeah. I think that here's the thing I would say about most people starting companies. I mean, maybe many of them are very ambitious from the beginning, but I mean, we were trying to rent 3 Airbeds, and the reason we were is because we wanted to pay rent. We weren't trying to start a global movement with hundreds of millions of community members. So I guess what happens is responsibility gets thrust on you very quickly. And my parents are social workers. So I was used to call my mom and dad and saying, Mom, Dad, I got this challenge, what do I do? And I call them up about this, and they they're brain melts, and it's just really hard. What do you do? I have all this responsibility. And so you end up getting this responsibility so quickly. And so I think my feedback to founders, I mean, I don't know how it's, I think they're often people, when they're thrust with responsibility, they don't want to be vulnerable. They want people to think that they know what they're doing, and they want to feel like they're knowers. And the problem is that the best thing you convince people is not that you know what you're doing, but that you can learn quickly. Because let's be honest, somebody starting something, regardless of age, they've never done before, you don't know what you're doing. And so I want to know that you can learn very quickly, and you can seek out one another, and you can have a very very short learning curve. And so I think that's the key thing. One of the things that Chip turned us on to was a book by Carol Dweck, which is called The Growth Mindset. And it basically, the very short version of the growth mindset is there's people who believe that your capabilities, your intellect is fixed. And so therefore, you defend who you are. You are afraid to make yourself vulnerable, and you don't want to admit you don't know something. And the problem is, if you're a knower and you know it all, well, there's nothing more to learn, and therefore you're not going to grow. And there are other people who believe that your potential is unlimited, that who you are is not fixed, that who you are is a moment in time, it can become and grow and evolve. And these are people that are growth mindsets. I think Chip and I just had that worldview. I think people often sometimes fall into one camp or the other. And that's probably the most important thing, is constantly having a growth mindset at any age.
Yeah, well, it's actually, so we codify everything in Silicon Valley. One of the things we talk about is this idea of, being a learning machine. And I remember talking with a fellow board member, Reid Hoffman, who's also early investor in Airbnb, and we were talking about the DNA of learning, how you create that culture of learning in a company. And Reid, one of the first things Reid mentioned was how in every interaction with you, Brian, he ended that you would end by asking, how could this be better? And it actually inspired me to adopt a similar practice. I almost at every meeting, end of every board meeting, I always ask that question. And it's amazing the things that you learn and hear that you otherwise wouldn't have. And
yeah, I think the key thing there is critical feedback only hurts your feelings if you think it's a criticism of who you are and always will be. But if you believe that you are a different person tomorrow than you are today, well, you're a different person based on the wisdom you gained from that feedback in that moment.
Well said.
And a lack of fear. So the thing about Brian, I mean, some CEOs might have been fearful to bring this other CEO who's 21 years older and has a lot of experience in the industry, and Brian had no fear about that. Mm-hmm. And he was very open, and I think it was great that we had a pretty good understanding that I didn't want his job, and frankly, I couldn't do his job. I want to be just really say it out loud. I could not have done the job that Brian Chesky has done or continues to do. He's a better leader today than I am. And I really believe that. And it's partly because of that improve, not just prove mindset, and the sense of I just want to get better at what I do. The key is then to create the culture where you create an environment where that's how the organization operates. And often an organization operates as an extension of a founder or a CEO. So I wouldn't be there still in a strategic advisor role, but I wouldn't have even started in the first place if I didn't see that in Brian. We occasionally had our challenges too.
Yeah,
But,
let's talk about
okay.
that. This is getting a little too
Oh,
harmonious.
okay. Yeah. I can feel that. I feel like, okay. Let's,
Brian, were there times when you felt like, man, he's just not getting it? It must be because of his age, for example.
I'm not going to say that.
Or likewise, Chip, when you were,
No, you didn't
were
get
you
it 'cause
trying
it
to
comes from the
impart
hospitality
wisdom?
industry.
yeah. I definitely didn't understand tech.
Yeah. Yeah. When he well, a funny story. When Chip first joined Airbnb, when he eventually joined as full time, which was like boiling the frog, so to speak, because he
Right.
thought he was joining for 8 hours, then it was 15 hours a week. And by the way, I want to say that like at one point, like you agreed to do 30 hours, and we went around the room asking how many hours everyone worked, and Chip said, I'm working like full time. And I'm like, okay, that's news to me. So I wasn't even clear, but I think I kept giving you more work and more projects and having you meet more
We'll
people.
come back
And
to
that
that.
was it was a good sign. But when he really immediately ramped up, he comes to me and he's super confused because he says that somebody's running product. And he's like, and you need to understand that in the hotel industry, the product is maybe the rightful definition, what the customer is buying. So in the hotel industry, the product are the hotels. And we had somebody who ran product. And in Silicon Valley, product means software, the person developing the software. And so Chip Conley is trying to understand, because he meets the head of product, like which like homes they're designing or how they're like managing the supply inventory, not realizing that we have a completely different definition of product. And at Airbnb, it's software. And software is this completely like new thing in the grand scheme of things to the hotel industry, because software was like maybe something you used to manage your inventory in the back end, but it was not something. And so I thought that was like a pretty funny thing, like just the different definitions.
Oh,
of
the lack
product.
of, I was so naive when it came to tech lingo and product or, so many other things. I think that I was fearful. I mean, I'll come back to what occasionally came up with Brian and me on my side, but I was fearful. I joined a company at age 52. I turned 58 this month. I joined at age 52, not ever being in a tech company. And I didn't really think of that when I joined. And then there's a great story.
Because you thought the product was
okay.
rooms, right?
Yes, the third day on the job, I'm in a room of engineers, there's a dozen of us, and I'm sitting in the room because I want to just like take it in, and I'm being quiet and invisible because I'm pretty dumb at this tech thing. And the engineers are talking their lingo, I don't know what they're saying, and then all of a sudden the 25-year-old wizard leading the meeting turns to me and said, if you shipped a feature and no one used it, did it really ship? What? I took philosophy in college, not comp sci. I looked bewildered, and I realized Chip was in deep ship. Because I had no clue, and fortunately he, quickly moved on to someone else.
By the way, that's not how everyone talks.
No, but it was just an interesting question, but I didn't know what it meant to ship a feature. So the fear I had early on was like, oh, I am not in my natural habitat. And I was pretty successful as the CEO of Joie de Vivre, of this company I started, and now I'm in something that I might not be successful at. And this is, I think, a really important question for people in midlife, to sort of say, when you're repotting yourself and doing something new, there's the fear of not succeeding. And so I had that going on as well. In terms of Brian, the thing that I think I noticed in Brian early on is Brian is full of ideas, so full of ideas. And the risk in that, as being the CEO of a company that's growing quickly, is like, there was like, we would go this way, and then we go a little bit this way, and it was like we were on a ship that had a drunken skipper.
To be clear, I wasn't drunk.
He was not drunk. He doesn't drink much. No, it had nothing to do with bad leadership, frankly. It had to do with so many choices. And there's a lot of choices when you've got a company that's growing quickly, and And we're a sharing economy darling, and people are coming to us with new sharing economy ideas. And that first year I was there in 2013, there were like 25 or 30 strategic initiatives. And so one of the things I really said, we got to get focused here. We need to everybody needs to be able to read from the same hymnal, so to speak, in terms of what's important here. And we took our East staff, our leadership team, to New York, which is not exactly a friendly territory for Airbnb. And we had an off-site retreat for 3 days with the 12 leaders. And we took 23 different ideas that the 12 people had all come with. And we said, next year, we're only going to have 4. These are the 4 ideas we're going to bet on. And I think, one of the things I say in the book is an elder is an editor. A modern elder is an editor. And I say that in the sense that the first half of our life is about accumulating, and the second half of our life is about editing. And actually being able to edit from a business perspective is pretty important. I think what did Steve Jobs talk about in terms of saying no to things?
Yeah, the value of saying no. It's the most important part of the job.
It's the most important part of the job is being able to say no. And so that's a form of editing.
And saying no is like the key is saying no to things you love and want.
Yeah.
Not saying no to just.
And it's hard. And there are times where Brian would say no to me on things that I really wanted us to do.
Well, actually, one funny thing. So a thought occurred to me as something we disagreed with. That I think was right about. Sorry. Because I have to shamelessly say this. But because you reminded me of it backstage. 2013.
Oh, yeah.
We're in a smallish office, like maybe size this room or something, maybe a couple rooms like this, but not huge. And I was very ambitious about the scale of Airbnb. And so we ended up leasing a floor and a half of a 250,000 square foot building. In fact, the building was so large that I remember when we were starting Airbnb, we had a real estate broker. She was touring us on small 5,000 square foot spaces. 5,000 square feet would be considered a kind of smallish office. And I remember looking at this giant building. I go, what is that? That looks like a shopping mall. And she said, oh, Twitter, Zynga, and some other companies are looking at that building. At one point, I said to myself, if we are so large, we have to work out of a shopping mall. Like that will never happen. And of course, soon enough, I'm realizing we need that shopping mall size space because we're going to fill it up. We move into a floor and a half of the building, and Chip pulls me aside. I'm like super proud. I'm like, look at this building. We're going to fill it up. And Chip pulls me aside and says, what are you doing? Like, I can't, like, what do you think? Like, this office is too nice, but more importantly, it's too big, and I'm really, really worried about it. And
I was wrong.
We've not only filled that building, but we filled like 5 or 10 other buildings that size.
So
can I just interject something
Please.
on that? Because actually, I think it's an interesting thing to poke on a bit, that I sometimes say that the near enemy of true wisdom is conventional wisdom. And, Brian, you've talked about how you learned that listening to experts actually led you astray, and you actually learned to listen to your instincts at times. And I know I certainly grappled with that, having so-called experts come along and kind of say, here's the conventional, way you do things, versus someone who, say, had maybe walked a mile in my shoes and could advise you from a place of actual experience. So I'd be interested to hear how you both think about distinguishing between conventional wisdom and true wisdom.
Wow. I have never thought of that. Conventional wisdom.
Well, what's called conventional.
Yeah, in the world that we live in here in San Francisco and the Bay Area is sort of unconventional often. And, I think what I don't enjoy, I hate going to conferences where there's a panel on stage and they're all saying the same thing, and it's sort of like the boring thing that everybody would say. So I don't enjoy that, and I don't enjoy conventional wisdom in the sense that if it's so obvious, why are you telling me this? What I really appreciate is when someone tells me something that gives me the sense of, oh, wow, I've never thought of it that way. Mm-hmm. And I do think that one of the things that a modern elder brings to the table on occasion is asking catalytically curious questions. And so the conventional wisdom is I lay out on the table for you how all this works, and I'm giving you all the knowledge. But what I really appreciate is when someone asks me a question that's a gift. And it's a gift because it actually opens my mind to it's often a why or what if question as opposed to what or how question. What or how questions is what conventional leaders focus on because it's an optimization question.
The art of the great question.
Yeah, why and what if is like, oh my God, that's an inefficient question because it forces you to start thinking bigger. And that's, to me, often where the true wisdom is.
I had a random question for you, Chip. The conventional wisdom, I suppose, from the traditional hospitality industry was that Airbnb wasn't going to work. Like that was the
Yes, for sure. They thought I was funny. I like that. They said, this is the field of dreams. As one person said, if you build it, they'll come. No, they said to me, if you build it, they will laugh.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So what do you think they missed? Like, why did, in that case, the conventional wisdom, what
great
underlying principles did they miss?
So I've learned last year at age 56 to start surfing. And the thing that is interesting about surfing is the better you get at surfing, the better you can actually read which is the wave you're going to actually ride. So conventional wisdom is surfing without the expert eyes, and you can't see the future. What they missed was that boutique hotels were a precursor, as you said earlier, to Airbnb. Boutique hotels started in the 1980s. They created a more adventurous traveler who didn't want just a Holiday Inn or a Hilton. They wanted something that was more experience-driven, more personalized, more localized to the place. Well, that's sort of live like a local is frankly what boutique hotels said they were doing, but Airbnb took it 10 steps further. So they missed that. I think they also missed that, the conventional wisdom is often by people who are conventionally older. And they didn't understand that there's a growing digital nomad world of people who are not upwardly mobile, they're outwardly mobile. Millennials love to travel, and they love to, frankly, in many cases, live on the road, not have a primary home, an apartment or a home, and they live in sort of temporary places, whether it's co-living situations or on Airbnb. They had no clue that was coming. They hadn't also realized that, frankly, VRBO and Craigslist in 1995 popularized the idea of vacation rentals to strangers, or Craigslist was, getting a roommate, a
So
stranger.
maybe like one way of maybe answering your question would be to say there's some inner truths that never change, but the surfaces do often. So people don't really change. How companies are organized don't really change. Leadership doesn't really change. It hasn't changed in like hundreds of years, really. How the modern management is really developed by Alfred Sloan, who was the first real CEO of General Motors almost a century ago. So there are a lot of things in life that are timeless. But then there's a lot of surface things. Status is timely. That won't continue. Like processes are timely. Those won't continue. What hotels offered is timeless. How they offered it was timely. And so I think disambiguating between the timeless and the timely is another way of being able to disambiguate between the conventional wisdom and the true wisdom.
I love that. And what prompted that question actually was when you talked about how, when in early Airbnb's days, there was a host whose home got trashed, and you said the experts told me, don't take responsibility because you'll be liable. And you did a lot of soul searching about that because things were getting worse, and you realized your instinct was actually led you to do the opposite, to take the responsibility.
Yeah.
So that's interesting of a timeless kind of principle.
Yeah. The timeless principle is that like your customers need to trust you.
Yeah, exactly.
So and if you don't take responsibility, then people will have a loss of trust and a loss of faith. The timely principle is that the era of internet platforms, if you take too much responsibility, you could become liable, and that could open you up to a kind of huge cascade of liability. And this is kind of, but this is, again, there's a very potentially surface level way of thinking about things.
Well,
And we call this first principles. In other words,
Right.
what are the underlying first principles that are timeless and unshakable? I often like to say, what will still be true in 20 years? What is still true in 20 years was often true 20 years ago. And much of the world will still be true in 20 years. The mechanism to deliver it will completely change. We often fall in love with these surface level mechanisms.
That's a great
people
frame.
may not
Yeah.
read physical, I don't know how much they'll read physical books in the future, but they certainly will read books in the future.
So back to the soul searching point, one of the things that's often not talked about is how we manage our own psychology, which I think is one of the hardest things about being a leader. And especially when you're on that emotional roller coaster ride of the, sort of the agony and the ecstasy, if you will. And a lot of, we romanticize the ecstasy. We barely talk about the private agony. Brian, how has your relationship with Chip helped you in that realm, or what resources have you drawn on in those moments?
Somebody once said that starting a company is like jumping off a cliff and assembling the airplane on the way down.
I think that was Reid Hoffman.
That was Reid Hoffman. And he told me that. And that describes it well. And it's also a huge emotional roller coaster. The highs are extraordinarily high. They're unlike anything I can describe before starting a company, but the lows can be extraordinarily low. And so, my dad, when I was younger, like when I was a kid, he used to, something like terrible had happened, and he said, Brian, things are never as good as they seem or as bad as they seem. And so we often are like completely up and down. I think like startup culture can allow you to get very high and very, very low. And one of the things that Chip did was also a moderating force. When I was really low, he'd pick me up. When I was really high, he'd kind of moderate me back to kind of a more medium set point. And all of this requires perspective. Like when you draw out time and you think, if you kind of like almost zoom out from yourself and think in terms of like how things might be, like in 10 years, the highs won't seem so high and the lows won't seem so low. And often what seems important today, when you take a perspective of 10 years, what seems important is completely inversed. In other words, like getting a lot of attention and accolades is timely, but having deep admiration of people that you respect and work with is timeless, because those people will be there with you. So I think like this time horizon also allows you a way to see truth and wisdom.
Beautiful. Let's talk a little bit about this term that you coined, modern elder.
Yeah.
Let's shift gears a little
How
bit.
many of you hate this term?
In a youth-obsessed culture, it's not exactly the most popular identity to think about elders. So what would you like it to mean to people, and what's modern about being an elder?
Well, the truth was that as I started to see my role being both the intern and the mentor at the same time, I realized there wasn't much of, I couldn't look at a lot of role models who'd done that. I also recognized that we aged in the U.S. in the 20th century 30 years. The average longevity in the year 1900 was 47, and it was 77 by the year 2000. Mm-hmm. So what used to be elderly is today elder. And what I mean by that is the average age of a person going into a nursing home was 65 50 years ago. Today, it's almost mid-80s. So there's this new era of life that starts, depending upon where you live. In Silicon Valley, it probably starts about age 35. Truly. I mean, literally, like, midlife used to be, first of all, midlife in the year 1900 was age 24, because it was 47. But by 1965, a new term had been coined, which is midlife crisis, 1965, because there was now midlife and there was a crisis. But 53 years later, after 1965, there is still no solution to this. And now it's not just 45 to 65, it's 35 to 75. It's a marathon. So what was a crisis is a marathon. Long story short is I really believe quite, down to my toes, that the value of that perspective and judgment and education that you've built over time, mixed with the curiosity of being the learner as well, can create a really potent opportunity for society to tap into that kind of modern elder. And so the elder of the past was held in reverence. And in some places in the world, that's true still, but not many. Asia, Latin America, but frankly, the more digital we get, the less reverence there is for the elder. But the modern elder is not held in reverence, but is appreciated for their relevance, not their reverence, because they can take timeless wisdom and apply it to modern day problems. But the only way they can do that is if they learn about the modern day problems. And that's the difference. And that's why I call it a modern elder, which is a bit of an oxymoron. But I don't have a better word to describe myself. And I think the first time I ever said this was I said it to Joe. I said, actually, no, you know what? I said it at an offsite retreat in Sonoma. I think I'd said it to Joe Gebbia, Brian's co-founder, one of his two co-founders. And Joe said, yes, you are the modern elder. And so I outed myself at an offsite retreat and I said, I think this is my future. And I really want to explore what it means to be a modern elder because I think that's what I've been here. So yeah, a lot of people have a hard time with it because it sounds too much like elderly. But what's been interesting over time is as people actually get what I'm talking about and then start to live it, the number of people who are saying, that's me, is growing.
Well, as an aging entrepreneur who's looking for ways to be useful, I'm
Modern elder?
grateful to
Modern
you
elder?
for making us sound cool.
Modern
yeah,
elder?
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
that's right.
Yes? Say it.
I am a modern elder.
Yes, there we go. All right.
And given that, wow, I wasn't expecting that. I guess I was the last to find out.
Oh, yes. Well,
Actually, Brian, I was going to ask you what kind of, given that internet years are like dog years, and at 35 you're going to be a modern elder. What kind of a modern elder you imagine you imagine yourself to become? Sort of.
Wow. Well, the first question I have is, at what age in 10 years will somebody be considered a modern elder? If it continues, I will be one sooner than later.
yeah.
I think I'm already seeing, sounds weird, but Airbnb is 10 years old. We have over 5,000 employees, and I'm already feeling whatever Chip is describing a little bit. I mean, I'm going to be honest, I'm already feeling it. I don't know when you start feeling it, but I'm feeling something. And I'm not sure what I'm feeling, but I'll tell you what I think I'm feeling. I now meet young entrepreneurs, and I'm calling them young. When I call somebody young, then I'm something
Yeah.
they're not.
Yeah.
And so I started the company when we were 26. I just turned 37. So in some definitions, maybe I am a tech modern elder because I'm across the 35-year-old threshold. But I meet people in their mid-20s, and they might be outside of Airbnb or inside of Airbnb, and they remind me of the person I was only 10 years ago. But 10 years ago, I was a completely different person than I am today. I was just so believed anything in the world is possible. I still believe that, but I wanted to be an entrepreneur, and what I want to do in the next years ahead of me is to be able to help entrepreneurs. I like to say that everyone at Airbnb should think like they're an entrepreneur. And I want to be able to help entrepreneurs inside and outside of Airbnb because I do believe entrepreneurs change the world. And I think the challenges of today, if you want to solve the challenges of today, I think you need to live. I think, first of all, you need to think globally. Almost all challenges today are global. Global warming, global terrorism, global nuclear armament, like the challenges of global automation. So almost all problems are global, and the internet is a global notion. The internet is not really a country-level idea. It's a global idea. The second thing is, because the entire world is now connected on the internet, though we create artificial boundaries of geography, they're mostly artificial because last year 1.3 billion people crossed the border. We also are, we're living together more geographically, but I think generationally there's becoming a greater and greater divide. And I think the greater geographic divide, the lack of wisdom there means that young people today are more isolated than ever, they're more insecure than ever, the suicide rate is going up. And it's just I think people are on this surface level hamster wheel. And so I think that bringing people together, that bridge, that generational bridge that Chip is talking about, is incredibly important. And I think that as people get older, they're not only still useful, that's almost like an understatement, but they're more useful than ever. Because I think coming together is the only way we're going to solve society's problems. I hope that people aren't thinking that the next 30-year-old is going to solve all the problems of tomorrow. That imagine the pressure that young person has with their limited life experience, that it's going to be all of us together solving it, and we have to be on the same side as one.
when I joined 5.5 years ago, it was very much a millennial company, both in terms of the employee pool, but generally speaking, in terms of the guest pool, and the hosts were sort of on the maybe on the cusp of Gen X and millennial. But over time, it's become a mainstream phenomena. And there's a couple, Michael and Debbie Campbell, who over 5 years ago sold their home in Seattle, and they're today now 73 and 63. And they went on the road for 5 years. And they've lived in 80 different countries, in over 200 homes. And so they're our most high-profile Airbnb guests in the world, even though they are boomers. And so initially, they became the senior nomads because New York Times profiled them. We had them come to our Airbnb open festivals, conferences and festivals where they could speak. And ultimately, Brian is a big believer in the idea of having the customer at a seat at the table for the leadership team. And so I said to Brian, like, let's have a voice of the customer. Let's bring in some, I called them the senior interns, sort of like, like Robert De Niro in the movie The Intern. Let's bring in Michael and Debbie Campbell and have them spend 10 weeks with us actually being the voice of the customer. And what I loved about Brian saying absolutely was there was no question. There was like age neutrality. There was no question about the fact that they were right for this.
Yeah, I mean.
Oops.
Yes. These two guests, Michael and Debbie, they've, I think, stayed in for 1,000 nights in an Airbnb in 80 different countries. And what I loved about Chip was, it's another thing that Chip brought to Airbnb, and it may have come from his wisdom, I don't know. But he was a great listener, and he had his ear to the ground of the community. He would do listening tours. He would meet with hosts. We really had his pulse on our very best guest, our very best host. And it's very easy for us to stop listening. And I think that, I presume wisdom makes people listen more. I presume that.
Perfect quote here. It's not my quote, but it's in the book. Knowledge speaks and wisdom listens. And I was at Summit Series in relatively younger entrepreneurs in Utah just a couple months ago. And I was about to go give a talk to a bunch of millennial entrepreneurs about wisdom. And just as I was going in, there was this guy with an eagle owl on his arm. And an eagle owl, I didn't even know that an eagle owl existed. And so I had the eagle owl on my arm. And so I asked the guy, so why is it that owls are considered the wisest animals or birds in the forest? And he says it's because they have the most finely attuned hearing. They listen better than anyone else. So I guess what I would say is wisdom is about listening. And it's not just about listening to the story, it's listening for the story. Because often the person who's telling you something is too sort of embedded in the story to actually see the common thread or the theme that you, maybe as the wise person listening, can help them with.
That's actually a great segue to two things that I think it's really important to talk about. And I've been so engaged in conversation, I lost track of time, and I want to make sure we get to some audience questions. But I'm going to mash up a question with something about this idea of listening and having ear to the ground. At a time when there's a lot of legitimate criticism being leveled at our industry, the tech industry, around our focus on money and hyper growth. You've made a number of choices that really seem to have a different motivation, that are coming from a place of wisdom and compassion even. And the Open Homes Initiative, for example, was particularly striking, especially at a time when people are displaced physically and psychically even. Talk a little bit about what Open Homes Initiative is and where it's at, and also kind of merging that with a question here, asking, kind of mentioning how they loved the Super Bowl ad on diversity. However, they said there is a being black on Airbnb. A lot of hosts say no to African American guests. What's the company doing for this? I know you've got some really powerful things that you've done. So if you can speak to those two, I think that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, so I'll start with Open Homes. So in 2000 and, was it 12 or 13, Sandy? Hurricane Sandy was 13. You were here, right? Yeah. So it would have been 2013. So Hurricane Sandy occurred in New York. It was obviously a hurricane, and thousands of people were displaced from their homes. And one day we get an email, and we get an email from a woman in Brooklyn, and the woman in Brooklyn, her name is Shell, and she says, I would like to host somebody in my home for free, but Airbnb won't let me. And we didn't let her because we had a $10 minimum charge you could charge per night, because we figured anything less than $10 is either a scam or something that's definitely not something you should be doing in your home. And so we made a minimum $10 threshold, and so we had to kind of scramble. It was like technically more difficult than you can imagine to actually like alter our payment system to bypass the reservation system so that things could be for free. But what we ended up building was a product that weekend. It was over the course of a week. Joe led it. So we ended up building this product where disaster evacuees could find a free place to live. Over the course of the over the last few years, we started seeing disaster after disaster occurring over the world, and so hosts were reaching out to us. So we turned this into a platform we called Open Homes. So I'll bring it to the We Accept, and then I'll end with the discrimination on our platform. In early last year, there was a travel ban that was obviously instituted or attempted to be instituted by President Trump. I don't usually opine on every political issue. I certainly can't. And we're in 192 countries, so I certainly can't opine on every political issue. But I do opine on political issues that are in opposition to our mission. And we believe in a world where people can live as one. And one of the best ways to change the world is to walk in other people's shoes, especially people that are not like you. And the more people you meet, the more you realize they're actually not dissimilar from you, they're like you. And what I've learned about Airbnb is not how different we are, it's how similar we are. We're 99% the same. And so this was something that was very, very important. So we spoke out against the travel ban. We said this is in opposition of everything we stand for, and anyone who is for a travel ban is going to be on the wrong side of history. So we decided to say that, but words are cheap unless those words are backed with a $4 million Super Bowl ad. So we decided to buy a spot for the Super Bowl maybe 10 days before the Super Bowl. Now, that is either
Crazy.
Actually, there's probably no other word than crazy, because most people, when they buy a Super Bowl ad, it's either a $4 million or $8 million buy. Because it's about $4 million per 30 seconds. And you will spend like a year in development. Like Budweiser will spend like the day after Super Bowl, they start having concept meetings like, what's our next thing going to be? Like a drunk frog, doing whatever with a horse. And so, I don't know. I think they did something like that once. And or there's like a puppy, and the puppy is a symbol for society. And we just kind of impulsively thought, like, I think our team said, like, hey, there's a 30-second Super Bowl spot available. Do you want it? And I said, sure, let's take it. And it wasn't completely impulsive. The team, Jonathan Mildenhall, our CMO, had come to us with this beautiful concept. But the 2 nights before, I kind of got cold feet, because I had a bunch of people come to me and say, if you do this and you run this, half the country's going to hate you, and Donald Trump is going to like start tweeting at you, and all these horrible things are going to happen, and you will probably never see you again. And so we had this ad, and the ad was going to basically be a community commitment that we created in response to discrimination on our platform. So to bring this back to your second question, and I'll close it full circle. A few years ago, there was this phenomenon, this really terrible phenomenon that occurred on our platform, and it was called, became a trending hashtag, Airbnb while black, where people on our platform were describing the travails of using Airbnb and experiencing discrimination. And I never fathomed this would happen. But of course, 3 white guys building a tech platform, there are limitations. The things we could conceive would be possible. We brought our life experience with us when we built the platform. And I was so optimistic. I think many of us in technology thought technology is inherently good, therefore the spread of technology is a good thing. I think one of the things we've realized is we must take more responsibility that technology can be used for good and not so good, and that we need to be very thoughtful about how we use it. So we made every single user, we did a number of things, but one of the things we did, and the most controversial thing, is we made everyone check a box on our platform saying that they attest that they will not discriminate no matter who they are, who they love, what gender they are, what race they are, what religion they are. We did that. We got tens of thousands of hateful emails, and I had a lot of people like pinging me directly on Twitter, and so we decided to double down and turn that attestation into a Super Bowl ad, and we were about to run it. It's 48 hours before the Super Bowl, and I get cold feet. And I'm like, oh, this is like the worst possible idea. I've done crazy things in the past, but this is the dumbest crazy thing I've done. So I called Jonathan, our CMO, and I said, I need you to sell the spot. We can't do this. Like, this is a bad idea. So, and he has to call Fox, and he's like, I don't think we can sell the spot. And I go, sell the spot. He calls Fox. Fox is like, this is a non-refundable spot. You ain't getting your money back. You're running this thing. And I thought, like, well, we could just like lose our $4 million. I don't want to lose $4 million, but like, what if Trump comes out, what's the damage of that? And he said, but the problem is like, then the spot will leak because they're gonna like, why did you pull out? So you're kind of stuck with it. And I'm like, oh my God, fine, we'll run it. We run the Super Bowl ad, and it turned, and then during that Super Bowl ad, we announced, the last thing I'll say is this commitment that over the next 5 years, in the spirit of not having borders, we are going to house 100,000 people that need housing, displaced people, not only disaster evacuees, but refugees. And we ran the Super Bowl spot last Super Bowl, and it was one of the most shared spots on Super Bowl Sunday, and we're still here. So.
Well, just on a personal note, as a refugee of war and an immigrant who had to flee my home on many occasions as a child and who faced discrimination, I just want to say thank you to you and all of the hosts who've opened your homes. I just feel a deep debt of gratitude. So thank you. Do we have time for one more question? Do I have to go straight to the 60-second? Oh, I have to go to the 60-second idea. All right, sorry about that. Okay, so I guess it is an Inforum tradition to ask all of our speakers one question, which is, what is your 60-second idea to make the world a better place? You want to start, Chip?
Sure. So you've certainly gotten the impression that I think modern elders or aging can be aspirational. So my 60-second idea is to create midlife wisdom schools around the world so that people can repurpose themselves. We have been living in the tyranny of the three-stage life. You learn till you're 25, you earn till you're 65, and then you retire till you die. That model, the millennials are completely disavowing it, and we as a culture are starting to disavow it. And that means that people in midlife need to actually mind their mastery and imagine how they can repurpose themselves. So created the first one of these in Baja California Sur, an hour north of Cabo San Lucas, called the Modern Elder Academy. I'm doubling down on that name. My team's right now in another location, looking at our second location. So long story short is I think midlife wisdom schools will be a thing of the future.
Awesome. Brian?
So I'm just making one up as I think, because there's plenty. I'll give you.
Because you're not doing enough to change the world.
No, not at all. Here's one random idea. It's not necessarily like a product, but I think that every single person in the world should have a passport. And I honestly think that maybe the idea would be some kind of global fund to allow every single person to leave their country and experience another community. As you travel more, you'll realize that what we call culture and what we call nations are the 2% that is so different, or the 1% so different. And I think that today on the internet, we are getting subdivided and hermetically sealed arguing with people that we've never met, we know little about, and we very rarely change anyone's mind anonymously over the internet. And I think the idea of the word connection, which has become a kind of misappropriated term for the internet, the most important sense of connection, the most important sense of community is what happens in the physical world between two people sitting across from one another, experiencing one another. And if more people could experience the world, if more people could have a passport, if more people could live together, you know, the amount of problems we could solve together, the amount of global conflicts that could be limited would be so vast as to change the world permanently and profoundly.
Thank you. So I think we have to close now. So I just wanted to say a few words to you both. Chip, your provocation to foster wisdom across the generations and in our companies, to pair wisdom with disruptive thinking, and to expand our notions of diversity to include age, is at once pragmatic in its idealism, and it's fundamentally human. And as an aging entrepreneur myself, I'm grateful to you for that. Brian, you are more than a young tech founder and CEO. You are the modern leader to Chip's modern elder. And you know, you're a leader whose North Star is principled and purpose-driven, whose sights are setting on building an enduring institution, and one who's willing to actively wrestle with the tough questions, including what our responsibility is in building a good society and a good world. The science fiction writer William Gibson, I think about this a lot because of where we live and what we do, said that the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And you know, being in this conversation feels like a visit to the future, a future where we bring the advantages of business and technology to all of humanity, and where we bring our humanity to the way that we do business and innovate. And for that, I want to thank you, because that's the kind of future I want to live in. Thank you both.
That
Thank
was
you.
Beautiful.
Thank you, everyone.
And thank you for joining us here at the Inforum at the Commonwealth Club. Please remain in your seats for further instructions on the book signing. And meanwhile, if you can join me in another big round of applause for Chip and Brian.